I want to shift the subject again, then, because I noticed you've been writing a lot about drug control policy and about alcohol. What are your sort of big think insights in the area of drugs and alcohol?
How do you think of drugs? I mean, drugs are, it's a huge issue. What I would say at the start is that I think that we are currently in a period of systematically underrating what a problem drugs are. And that may seem surprising because everyone sort of pays lip service to. Everyone sort of is like, yeah, there's a drug crisis. But like, we don't really act like it's a crisis. 100,000, probably 110,000 people died from drug overdose. That was last year. That's actually the standard of the past 2 to 3 years. Drug overdose is an enormous problem. We don't really think a lot about how to address it. We still sort of treat it like it isn't nearly, the 100,000 figure, that's like a 5-fold increase over 10 years ago, like a 10-fold increase over 20 years ago. It's an enormous increase in deaths. But I think we were also, across the board, much more sanguine about addictive substances than we were 30 years ago. There's a theory that like drugs and drug culture go in cycles, and alcohol's involved in this too, where our level of, we learn about a drug, we try it, we're really excited about it. We start to experience the adverse harms of it. We swing wildly in the other direction. We ban it. We regulate it away. We become naive, and then we try it again. And I think you saw this cycle at the start of the 20th century, before we actually prohibited drugs. You saw the cycle again in the 60s and 70s, with both marijuana and cocaine, heroin too in the 60s. And then we're, I think, starting to see it again. So you see it in illicit drug use, sort of hard, quote unquote, hard drug use. You see it with the transition to fentanyl, the spread of methamphetamine again, its sort of expansion. But you also see it in growing use of marijuana. You see it in growing use of psychedelics. People are starting to notice that like large fractions of our juvenile population is hooked on amphetamines in the form of Adderall, to often seriously debilitating effect.
So
all
let
of
me
this
get,
probably.
I just want to ask whether it's appropriate to draw any lines here, hard drugs and recreational and all of that, and Adderall use, which is yet another thing. Are you lumping them all together inappropriately, or at least I just want to get you to address that?
Yeah. So the answer is yes and no. Is it every addictive substance is different in the way that it affects users. It's different in the way that in what its risks and harms are. For example, so like take something like cigarettes. Smoking one cigarette, very few acute harms. Your risk of nicotine toxicity is basically nil. Very large chronic harms. Something like I don't know, amphetamine, your acute harm risk is much higher, but you have a long-term harm risk. Marijuana is mixed acute and chronic harms. The point is, it is, when we talk about like, can you say some drugs are pretty bad and some drugs are not? What I really like to say is like, drugs have different risk profiles and you need to regulate accordingly. That's certainly true. The other thing I would say is you can extract a like general factor of toleration for drugs. You can say like the way in which we regard drugs and their tolerability tends to swing together over time. That in periods where we are using one substance, we are using another substance as well. And our capacity as a society to respond to substances seems to struggle to differentiate them. So in that regard, I think that it makes sense to sort of say, we are in a period, one of these historical periods, where we are comparatively more sanguine about drug use across a variety of across a spectrum of substances, and that we sort of try to draw these lines is in part like a product of we are trying to become more sanguine about some substances. That like we sort of worry about meth use, but we don't worry about recreational amphetamine use, even though they're kind of the same substance. That we think about cigarettes and marijuana as being wildly different, even though in many ways they're quite similar. This is a function of we pick and choose which substances we want to tolerate. But my assertion is like, in part, we are moving towards the impulse is towards an increase in tolerance generally, all else being equal.
Now, okay, what role has criminalization of use, the legal system, to play in what's a larger social management problem? You know, if you got Adderall and you got cannabis and you got alcohol, we haven't even mentioned alcohol. That presumably has to be in the discussion. You know, we're not going to go back to the days of prohibition on alcohol, and every jurisdiction has got a referendum now about legalizing cannabis, it seems. So where are you in that debate about criminalization?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that we can say a couple of things. There's sort of a what should people have the right to do conversation, which we can get into. But I think that everyone actually has very conflicting intuitions here, right? Like I know the people who are consistent on that front are people who believe that heroin should be legal and sold in vending machines. I know those people. I believe they're consistent and wrong, and nobody's going to listen to them, at least not currently. Everybody else thinks that there's a balance of costs and benefits that is relevant to play out here, right? Like, there's some benefit to letting people use heroin. Like, heroin's fun. But then on the other hand, there are also lots of costs to letting, like, Walmart sell you heroin out of vending machines, and the costs outweigh the benefits. What I would say from the perspective of enforcement is that there are different components of enforcement. There is prohibition per se, and then there's how prohibition is enforced. Let me give you an example. Until 6 years ago, sports gambling, and gambling is addictive, sports gambling was prohibited in most states. It had been prohibited for about 30 years. Extremely low levels of enforcement. There were like fewer than 3,000 arrests a year nationwide for gambling-related offenses. But also, there was there was very little what we might call industrialized or commercialized sports gambling. They're like, little gambling operations. They weren't very efficient. 2018, the Supreme Court says, okay, we're gonna strike down the relevant law. 30 plus states now, relevant federal law, 30 plus states now have sports gambling. You can gamble on your phone. If you've ever watched a sporting event, you are barraged with ads about sports gambling, and it's having
very
real
disquieting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't like it, to be honest with you. Maybe I'm just an old-fashioned guy, but, they're telling me to bet on the game while I'm watching the game?
We know that I forget the numbers, but it's something like in New Jersey's data, 60% of the expenditures come from 5% of users. Like, those are problem gamblers. They will lose all their money. Some of them will do serious harm to their lives. Some of them will commit suicide. This has been the experience of the UK that legalized sports gambling 15 years ago. It's extremely bad. It's a very standard what happens when you let big retailers sell addictive substances. So prohibition per se, which is just like, basically what prohibition does is it makes it hard for businesses to operate effectively, to operate economically. You lose lots of efficiencies when you're prohibited from interacting with the financial system, from advertising, from like selling. It becomes hard to sell stuff across borders. Then we talk about enforcement, right? Like, there's a very wide range of possible levels of enforcement. Between 1970 and 1990, we almost exponentially increased the level of enforcement in the United States, drug enforcement specifically. The number of people who are getting arrested, the number of people who end up incarcerated. I think what we can now say from that experiment, and I'm willing to sort of defend I don't think that experiment was as crazy at the time as we take it to be now. But I think what we can say from that experiment is it didn't work.
This is the war on drugs that you're talking about.
This is the war on drugs. And I'm willing to defend. I think the war on drugs was in ways nobler than we give it credit for. But what I think you saw was it comes down to elasticities, right? So like for the benefit of your listeners, elasticities are if you increase the price of something by 1%, what is the percentage change in consumption of that price? If you increase the level of enforcement, you will have an effect on the level of consumption of a good, of a prohibited good. But we have good empirics now to say that the elasticity of consumption for addictive substances depends on whether or not you're addicted. So what we saw is that in the 80s, there's a big burst of enforcement, and like the number of people who consume actually craters pretty substantially. Like between late 1970s and the 1980s, late 1980s, the number of high schoolers, the number of Americans, there are many fewer people consuming drugs. And then it like flattens out, and measures of the total number of drugs consumed basically remain flat. And what that tells you is that so casual users have a fairly elastic response to enforcement. They stop using. That's good. But then once you've convinced all the casual users to stop using, adding additional enforcement, you're trying to target people who are addicted to the substance, and they have a fairly inelastic demand for drugs. And so mostly what you are doing with that population is like cycling them through the jail system without actually taking the steps you need to reduce their use. So you're not making the problem any better. So what I end up saying, I have a paper coming out about this in a couple of months, is prohibition is beneficial in general for substances you want to control. Some level of enforcement is important for controlling the extent of casual use. After a certain level, you hit diminishing marginal returns pretty rapidly, and you need to start thinking about other more public health-oriented strategies. That was a very long answer, but that is sort of the
no,
big
that's
thing.
good. That's back, you're back to your extensive margin, intensive margin point.